Some of you may have heard that the Disney Corporation is responsible for at least one real-life ghost town. Disney built the Treasure Island Resort in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. It didn't start off as a ghost town. Disney cruise ships would actually stop at the resorts and leave tourists there to relax in luxury. This is a fact, look it up. Disney blew $30 million on the place. Yes, $30 million. Then they abandoned it. Disney blamed the shallow waters too shallow for their ships to safely operate, and there was even blame cast on the workers, saying that since they were from the Bahamas they were too lazy to work a regular schedule. Well, that's where this factual nature of the story ends. It wasn't because of sand, and it obviously wasn't because of foreigners being lazy. Both are convenient excuses. Now, I sincerely doubt that these reasons were legitimate. Why don't I buy the official story? Because of Mowgli's Palace. Near the beachside city of Emerald Isle in North Carolina, Disney began construction of Mowgli's Palace in the late 90s. The concept was a jungle-themed resort with a large, you guessed it, palace in the center of the whole thing. If you're unfamiliar with the character of Mowgli, then you might better remember the story The Jungle Book. If you haven't seen it anywhere else, you'd notice the Disney cartoon from decades past. Mowgli is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals and simultaneously threatened/pursued by other animals. Mowgli's Palace was a controversial undertaking from the start. Disney bought up a ton of high-priced land for their project, and there was actually a scandal surrounding some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes, and then turned around and sold the properties to Disney. At one point, a home that had just been constructed was immediately condemned with little to no explanation. The land grabbed by the government was supposedly for some fictional highway project. Knowing full well what was going on, people started calling it Mickey Mouse Highway. Then there was the concept art. A group of stuffed shirts from Disney Co. actually held a city meeting. They intended to sell everyone on how lucrative this product was going to be. When they showed the concept art, this gigantic Indian palace surrounded by jungle, staffed with men and women in loincloths and tribal gear, well, suffice to say, everyone flipped their shit. We're talking about a large Indian palace, jungle and loincloths, not only in the centre of a relatively wealthy area, but also a somewhat xenophobic area of the southern USA. It was a questionable mix at that point in history. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but he was quickly subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. Disney took that community and essentially broke it over its knee as well. The land was cleared, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do or say about it. Local TV and newspapers were against the resort at the beginning, but some insane connection between Disney's media and the holdings and the local venues came into play, and their opinions turned on a dime. So anyway, Treasure Island in the Bahamas. Disney sunk those millions in and then split. The same thing happened with Mowgli's Palace. Construction was complete, visitors stayed at the resort, the surrounding communities were flooded with traffic, the usual annoyances associated with an influx of lost and irate tourists. Then it all stopped. Disney shut it down and nobody knew what the hell to think, but they were pretty happy about it. Disney Lost was pretty hilarious and wonderful to a large group of folks who didn't want this in the first place. I honestly didn't give the place another thought since hearing it closed over a decade ago. I live maybe 4 hours from Emerald Isle, so I really only heard the rumblings and didn't really experience any of it firsthand. Then I read this article from someone who had explored the Treasure Island Resort and posted a whole blog about all the crazy shit he found there. Stuff just left behind. Things smashed, defaced, probably ruined by disgruntled former employees who had lost their jobs. Hell, the locals from all around probably had a hand in wrecking that place. People there felt just as angry about Treasure Island as folks here did about Mowgli's Palace. Plus, there were rumours that Disney had released their aquarium stock into the local waters when they closed. Who wouldn't want to take some swings at some merchandise after that? Well, what I'm getting at is this blog about Treasure Island got me thinking. Even though many years have passed since its closing, I figured it might be cool to do some urban exploration at Mowgli's Palace. Take some photos, write about my experience, and probably see if there was anything I could take home as a memento. I'm not going to say I wasted no time in getting there, because honestly, it took me another year after I first found that Treasure Island article to actually get around to going up to Emerald Isle. Over the course of that year, I did a lot of research on the Palace Resorts, or rather I tried to. Naturally, no official Disney site or resource made any mention of the place. Even odder, however, there was nobody before myself that had apparently thought to blog or even post a photo. None of the local TV or newspaper sites had one word about the place, though that was to be expected since they all swung Disney's way. They wouldn't want to be out there announcing their embarrassment, you know. Recently I learned that corporations can actually ask Google, for example, to remove links from the search results, basically for no good reason. Looking back, it's probably why no one spoke of the resorts, because their words were made inaccessible. So in the end, I could barely find the place. All I had to go on was an old as hell map I received in the mail back in the 90s. It was a promotional item sent to people who had recently been to Disney World, and I guess since I'd been there in the late 80s, that was recent. I didn't intend to hang on to it, it just got shoved into my books and comics from my childhood. I'd only remembered it a few months into my search, and even then it took me another few weeks to locate the storage bin my parents had all shoved it into. But I did find it. Locals were no help, as most of them were transplants who had moved to the beach in recent years. The drive took me through an inordinately long corridor of overgrowth, tropical plants that run rampant and overpopulated the area with a mix of the native species of flora that actually belonged there and had tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort. The gate itself had been gouged in several places by woodpeckers and eaten away at the base by burrowing insects. Hanging at the gate was a sheet of metal, some random scrap, with hand-painted letters scrawled in the back. Abandoned by Disney. Clearly the handiwork of some past local or employee who wanted to make some small protest. The gates were open, enough to walk through but not drive. So I grabbed my digital camera and the map, whose flip side showed a layout of the resort, and I set off on foot. Palm trees stood unattended and ragged among piles of their own coconuts. Banana plants stood on their own stinking bug-riddled refuse. There was a sort of clash between order and chaos, as planted rows of flowers mixed with the obnoxious tall weeds and stinking blackened mushrooms. All that remained of any outdoor structures were broken, rotting wood and various charred bits of unidentifiable material. What was most likely an information booth or an outdoor bar was now a simple pile of assorted debris, chopped up by past vandalism and ravaged by weather. The most interesting thing on the grounds was the statue of Blue, the friendly bear from the Jungle Book, which stood at a sort of courtyard in front of the main building. He was frozen in a jovial wave towards no one, staring into empty space with a silly toothy grin as birdshit covered the whole swaths of his fur and vines ensnared his platform. I approached the main building of the palace, only to find the outside of the building covered in graffiti where the original paint hadn't peeled and chipped away. The front doors weren't just open, they'd been taken off their hinges and probably stolen. Above the front doors, or the gap where they should have been, someone had once again painted, "Abandoned by Disney." I wish I could tell you all about the awesome stuff I found in the palace. Forgotten statues, abandoned cash registers, a full-fledged society of homeless bums. But no. Inside of the building was so bare I actually think people had stolen the moulding off the walls. Anything that was too big to steal, counters, desks, fake trees, they were all resting amid this empty echo chamber that amplified my every step like a slow rat-a-tat of a machine gun. I checked the floor plan and headed in all the locations that might seem in any way interesting. The kitchen, as you would imagine, an industrial food prep area with all the applications and space, no expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door knocked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place smelled like very old piss. The huge freezer, not even remotely cool now, had row upon row of empty shelf space. Hooks hung from the ceiling, probably for hanging cuts of meat, and as I stood inside for a moment, I noticed they were swinging. Each hook swung in a random direction, but their movements were slow and small. It was almost impossible to see. I figured it must have been caused by my footsteps, so I stopped one from swinging by clutching it with my fist, then carefully letting it go, but within seconds it started swinging once more. The bathrooms were in much the same state as the rest of the place. There was about half an inch of rancid, stinking, stagnant water on the floor, so I don't want to stay there very long. What's odd about the toilets and the sinks was that they all dripped and leaked, or just ran freely. It seemed to me like they should have shut off the water a long, long time ago. There were also plenty of rooms in the resort, but naturally I don't have the time to look through them all. The few that I did peer into were wrecked. I didn't expect to find anything there, although I actually thought I heard a television or radio in one of the rooms, as I really think I heard a quiet conversation coming out. Though it was like a whisper, probably my own breathing echoing in silence, or just another case of the sound of flowing water playing tricks on my mind. This is what it sounded like. I didn't believe it. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Your father told you. I know, that sounds ridiculous, but I'm just telling you what I experienced. I just thought there might have been some vagrants in there who, well, would have knifed me. At the front doors of the palace again, I figured I hadn't found anything of note and had wasted the trip up. As I looked out the door, I noticed something in the courtyard that I had apparently missed. Something that would give me at least one thing to show for my trouble, even if it was just a photograph. There was a lifelike statue of a python, maybe 80 feet long, on a pedestal in the center of the area. It was almost time for the sun to start setting, so the light fell onto the object in a perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and snapped a photo. Then I stood on my toes and snapped another. I moved closer again to get a bit more detail of its face. Slowly, casually, the python lifted its head, looked directly into my eyes, turned, and slithered off the pedestal across the grass and into the trees. All 80 feet of it, its head long disappeared into the woods before its tail even left the sunning spot. Disney had released all their exotic animals onto the ground. Right there on my floor plan map was the reptile house. I should have known. I read about the sharks in Treasure Isle, and I should have known they'd done this. I was dumbfounded, just utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back down to earth and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times and backed away from where the snake had been, back towards the palace. Even though it was totally gone, I still wasn't taking any chances and backed my way into the building. I looked for a place to sit down as my legs were feeling a bit like jelly at this point. Of course there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline in the broken glass and dead leaf carpet. I had seen some stairs somewhere near the palace's lobby. I decided to go there and have a seat until I felt better. The staircase was far enough away from the building to be relatively clean, except for a startling amount of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off the wall, once again painted with the abandoned by Disney motto I'd become accustomed to. I placed the wedge on the stairs and sat on it to keep at least somewhat clean. The stairway led downward below ground level. Using my camera flash as an improvised flashlight, I could see the staircase ended up in a metal mesh door with a padlock. A sign on the door, a real sign, read, "Mascots only. Thank you." This perked up my spirits a little bit for two reasons. 1. A mascot only area would definitely have some interesting stuff back in the day. 2. The padlock was still in place. Nobody had gone down there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. This was the place I could actually explore and perhaps find something interesting to photograph or steal. I had come to the palace essentially agreeing with myself that it was okay to take anything I wanted because, hey, abandoned. It didn't take much to bust the lock. Well, actually, that's wrong. It didn't take much to burst the metal plate on the wall that held the lock into place. Time and decay had done most of the work for me, and I was able to bend the metal plate enough to pull the few screws out of the wall, something nobody else had apparently thought of or had not been able to do at the time. The mascot's only area was a startling and very welcome change from the rest of the building I'd seen. For one, every second or third fluorescent light overhead was illuminated, even though they flickered and faded randomly. Although nothing had been stolen or broken, even the age and exposure was definitely taking their toll. Tables had notepads and pens, there were clocks, even a punching clock on the wall complete with filled out time cards. Chairs were scattered around, and there was even a small break room with an old static field television and long rotted out food and drink on the counters. It was like one of those post-apocalyptic movies where everything was left in a state of evacuation. As I walked the maze-like sub-basement hallways of the mascot's only area, the sights just became more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and tables were knocked over, papers scattered and almost melded with the damp floor, and large carpets of mould slowly overtaking the real rotten crimson floor covering. Anything wood disintegrated into mush when I applied even the least amount of force, and clothing items hanging on hooks in one of the rooms simply fell into moist threads if I tried to unhook them. One thing that annoyed me was that light was becoming more sparse and unreliable as I went further into the dank, suffocating depths of the place. Eventually I reached a black and yellow striped door with the words Character Prep 1 stenciled on it. The door wouldn't open at first. I figured this was probably where the costumes were kept. I definitely wanted a photograph of that twisted, stinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick I tried, the door wouldn't budge. That is until I gave up and started to walk away. That was when I heard a slight popping sound, and the door creaked open slowly. Inside, the room was completely dark, pitch black. I used the camera flash to look for a light switch in the wall by the door, but there was nothing. As I made my search, I jumped at the sound of a loud electrical buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashed into life, flickering and fading in and out like the rest I'd passed. It took a second for my eyes to adjust. It seemed like the light was going to just keep on getting brighter until the bulbs exploded. But just as I thought it would reach that critical stage, the lights dimmed a bit and steadied. The room was exactly how I'd pictured it. Various Disney costumes hung on the walls, fully put together like strange cartoon cadavers hung from invisible nooses. There was an entire rack of loincloths and native clothes on hangers towards the back. What I found odd and what I wanted to photograph right away was a Mickey Mouse costume in the center of the room. Unlike the other costumes, it was lying on its back in the center of the floor like a murder victim. The fur on the costume was rotting and shedding, creating bare patches. What was even odder, however, was the coloring of the costume. It was like a photo negative of the actual Mickey Mouse. Black where he should have been white, white where he should have been black. His normally red overalls were light blue. The sight was off-putting enough that I actually put off photographing the thing until last. I took a picture of some of the costumes hanging on the walls, upward angles, downward angles, side shots to show an entire row of frozen, putrid cartoon faces with plastic eyes missing. Then I decided to stage a shot, just one of a character's head on the slick, grimy floor. I carefully reached for a headpiece of Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so that the thing wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked up into the face of the wide-eyed, mouldering head, a loud clattering sound made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet, and there, between my shoes, was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head and shattered into pieces at my feet. Only the empty face and the lower jaw remained, staring up at me. I dropped the duck head immediately, as you would expect, and moved to the door. As I stood in the doorway, I looked back at the skull on the floor. I had to take a picture of it, you know. I had to. For any number of reasons that may seem silly, but only if you don't bother to think it through. I would need proof of what happened, especially if Disney was somehow going to make this go away. I had no doubt in my mind, right from the start. that even if this was just gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. That's when Mickey, that photo negative opposite Mickey in the middle of the floor, started to get up. First sitting up, then climbing to its feet. The Mickey Mouse costume, or whoever was inside it, stood there in the center of the room, its fake face just staring directly at me as I mumbled, "No, no, no, no," over and over and over and over again. With shaking hands and violently thrashing hearts, I managed to lift the camera and aim it at the opposite creature now quietly sizing me up. The digital camera screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey costume. As the camera moved in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels spread, marring the screen wherever Mickey's outline moved to. Then the camera died, went black and quiet and broken. I raised my eyes once again to the Mickey Mouse costume. "Hey," it said in a hushed, perverted but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice. "You want to see my head come off?" It started to pull at his own head, working its clumsy, gloved, clawed fingers around its neck, with clawing, impatient movements similar to a wounded man trying to pull himself free from a predator's jaws. I turned away as I heard a sickening tear of both cloth and flesh. I only cared about getting away. Above the doorway out of this room, I saw the message clawed into the metal with bone or fingernails. "Abandoned by God." I never got the pictures out of the camera. I never wrote the blog entry about it. After that place I ran, fled for my sanity, if not for my very life. I knew Disney didn't want anyone to know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in. And they didn't want anything like that getting out.